The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Nodulator Pro, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
So ideally, if you have weeds up in your field prior to planting soybeans, you control those weeds a week or two prior to planting with a Burndown herbicide application. But what happens when weather conspires against you, maybe excessive rain and wind, such that once you get those soybeans planted, you don't have a pre-plant Burndown on. Now you want to control those weeds after planting. And so especially if you have weeds like glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane and glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed, the herbicide options to control those weeds have very strict restrictions that they can't be applied 3 days after planting. So we set up an experiment here at the Aurora Research Station to see what happens if we extend that application further past the labeled stage. What impact does it have on crop injury, and what impact does it have on yield? We're going to look at 3 herbicides. Let's start with 2,4-D-ester. So the 2,4-D-ester label specifies that you can apply 3 at planting and as long as 3 days after planting. And so here what we did is we applied 3 days after planting. So at this stage, the soybean seed had started to put on a little shoot, or a little radicle, a little root. And when we look in this field, or this plot area, pretty easy to see the typical leaf strapping that's associated with 2,4-D-ester. And so even at the labeled stage of 3 days after planting, we're seeing this injury, especially in a year like this with lots of moisture. So the key will be, what does this look like when we take it to more extremes? 6 days after planting, 9 days after planting. So let's look at the extreme of this 2,4-D application window. So we looked at 2,4-D-ester applied 3 days after planting when the soybean seed had a small radical root, some visual injury, but no reduction in stand. The stand in this plot area and the untreated areas is about 145,000 plants per acre. When we get to a window that maybe farmers wish to push, the 6 days after planting window, the soybean seed itself now has an inch hypocotyl, so it's getting closer to reaching the surface of the soil. When I look in here at those plots where we applied 2,4-D-ester 6 days after planting, we still see the visual leaf strapping, but the one thing we've observed is now we've actually reduced plant population a little bit. Instead of 145,000 plants per acre, we're now sitting at about 130,000 plants per acre. So we'll see if that actually affects yield. The much more extreme is when we go to 9 days after planting, and in this particular scenario, now the beans, we can actually row them as we drop by. Half of the population is at the cotyledon stage above ground, probably the other half is underground, and you can see here, not only do we see significant leaf strapping and now some stunting and an uneven stand. When we do plant population counts here, we're now at 90,000 plants per acre. So with 2,4-D-ester, clearly we don't want to be in this window. The more interesting thing to look at harvest time is, was there a yield impact of going a little bit later at 6 days after planting? So we'll have to take a look in the fall for that. So another herbicide that we looked at is Aragon liquid. So it's often used to control glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane or glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed. And here we're at 9 days after planting. So again, remember, we could row the soybeans. They were poking through the ground. And surprisingly, here at this site with this variety, very minimal crop injury, such that we're a month after application and I can't see any sign of injury. In terms of plant stand, instead of 145,000 plants per acre, we're at about 133 plants per acre. Whether that has a yield impact or not, we'll have to see this fall. But surprisingly with Aragon, you apply it past the labeled stage of 3 days after planting to 6 days after planting, and even 9 days after planting, which we wouldn't recommend. Surprisingly decent plant stands. So we're at the last treatment, and for me the most surprising treatment, it's a product called Sencor, the active ingredient you might know in other products like Boundary, Canopy Pro. We applied this 9 days after planting here, so as the beans were out of the ground, I would have thought we would have smoked these beans pretty good, but we did see a fair bit of visual injury early on, and we lost some leaves, but plant stand is identical to the weed-free control. We're a month after application, and you'd be hard-pressed to see injury here. So quite surprising with Sencor that we could get away even 9 days after application and not reduce plant stand and cause a lot of crop injury. So what's the take home from this site so far this season, right? So again, we wanted to look at 3 different burn down herbicides and how far we can push the limit. I guess the main surprising thing for me is we didn't kill any soybeans. I would have thought if we had applied 2,4-D to emerge beans, we would have killed soybeans. Now they're not healthy, I don't want to give you that illusion, but surprisingly here, no matter what we did, we didn't kill beans. But I think there's some quick take-homes, and so with 2,4-D ester, if we're using that to kill weeds after planting, I think we have to do that within 3 days. There's way too much injury and stand loss after that point that I think most people would be uncomfortable with that. But when it comes to Aragon and Sencor, there's a bit more wiggle room there. We didn't really see any injury with Aragon until the beans were poking out of the ground, which we would expect. We don't want to be in that window, but maybe here at this site you'd look and say, well, 6 days after planting was a reasonable risk to take, no reduction in stand, no significant crop injury. And then with Sencor, wow, I certainly feel comfortable going 6 days after planting. I'm even a bit more comfortable now going, geez, if those beans are just almost cracking through, probably a reasonable risk to take, especially if you don't have those weeds controlled. That's the whole context here. Risk is good if we get rewarded for it. And so if there's weeds we need to kill, then that's maybe where we'll take the risk. But the real risk is in yield. And to do that, we got to come back this fall. So we're going to do that, look at yield, and then summarize this all and have it on RealAgriculture.com.